Zane Mitchell had always known the world in ways that others didn't. The streets of Philadelphia were his domain, even though his eyes had been blind since the age of 7. He moved through the world with a rhythm, a cadence all his own, relying on senses that were far more acute than most people realized. His fingers felt the hum of the subway tracks beneath his feet, his ears caught the subtle whispers of the wind as it threaded through the trees. But none of these sensations were as extraordinary as the one he had learned to live with for the past few years. The ability to feel the future. It wasn't like a vision, not really. There were no flashes of light or images of distant events unfurling in front of his eyes. It was more like a series of vibrations that rippled through the air, through the ground, through his very chest. Each vibration was a fragment of what was to come. A murmur of sound, a tremor, a beat. Sometimes, it was a passing sensation, a fleeting moment in time he could barely hold on to. Other times, it was sharp, insistent, impossible to ignore, but he hadn't fully understood it, not at first. And even now, years after the accident that had taken his sight, Zane still wasn't sure what to make of it. The first time he noticed the sensation, he'd been walking down the sidewalk, trying to find his way to his favorite coffee shop. The ground beneath his feet had felt off. Like something was wrong. At first, he'd dismissed it, just his mind playing tricks on him. But then, when he stepped into the street, he'd felt the vibrations of an approaching car. But it wasn't the usual vibrations of an ordinary vehicle. This one was sharper, faster, more insistent. It was only when the car swerved and honked that Zane realized he'd barely dodged the thing. He'd been so close to being run over, and yet, somehow, his instincts had guided him to the right place at the right time. That was the beginning. That was the moment when he realized that the vibrations weren't just about the present. They were about the future. The possible future. And with that realization, his world, already so different from others, became even more disorienting. Zane had come to trust these vibrations, even if they often left him more confused than enlightened. He didn't fully understand how or why they worked, but they were always there, like a constant hum in the background of his life. Sometimes, they warned him of small, mundane events. Other times, they nudged him towards something bigger, something urgent. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Zane was at work behind the counter of his usual coffee shop, Brewed Awakening. He loved the place, the smell of fresh coffee, the hum of conversation, the rhythm of the baristas at work. It was a steady, predictable environment, and for someone like Zane, that was comforting. He had his routine down to a science. He could make every drink without even thinking about it, his fingers moving with practiced ease. He knew the layout of the counter like the back of his hand, and he knew the regular customers by the sound of their voices and the footsteps they made when they walked in. But today, as he steamed milk for a cappuccino, he felt something different, a slight tremor, deep in his chest. It wasn't a normal vibration. It was like a strange, electric pull, a tugging at the edges of reality. Zane paused, his hand hovering over the milk jug. He felt it again, a sharp, uneven rhythm that seemed to echo from somewhere far off, but at the same time, right next to him. He turned his head toward the door, his face a mask of concentration. The bell above the entrance chimed, and in walked a woman. Zane felt the vibrations as she stepped across the threshold, felt her energy sweep through the air in sharp, jagged pulses. It was as if the very atmosphere around her crackled with an intensity he couldn't quite place. She was in her late 50s, her silver hair tucked into a neat bun, her posture erect, as if she carried the weight of something heavy, though Zane couldn't tell what. She walked to the counter and placed her order with the kind of efficiency that spoke of someone used to commanding attention. "A medium latte, please," she said, her voice sharp but not unkind. Zane nodded, already moving to prepare the drink, but the vibrations were getting stronger. More urgent. They were coming from her now, pulsing like waves crashing against a shore. He didn't know how to describe it, but something was off. Something about this moment felt wrong, as if he could sense the exact moment when it would all go wrong. His fingers faltered as he reached for the espresso machine. His heart started to race. What was it? And then it came, a flash, sudden and vivid. The future unfolded before him, almost like a movie playing in his mind. The woman, this customer, was walking out of the shop, holding her latte. Her steps were slow, measured, but there was an unmistakable tremor to the way she moved. Then, in the next instant, she tripped on the curb outside, tumbling forward with horrifying speed. Zane could almost hear the sound of the impact, her body hitting the pavement, the screech of tires. In the vision, the woman didn't get up. The car coming toward her was moving too fast. The sight was so clear, so detailed, that Zane's breath caught in his throat. His fingers clenched around the steaming jug, and for a moment, the world seemed to go silent. There was no time to think, no time to question the validity of the vision. He knew what he had to do. With one sharp motion, Zane pushed the drink toward the woman. "Please, wait," he said, his voice steady, even as his heart pounded in his ears. I think you need to be careful. There's something out there." The woman looked up at him, startled. "What?" I think you should wait a moment before you go out," Zane insisted, stepping forward, feeling the pulsing energy of the future around her. Her confusion was evident. "What are you talking about?" But Zane didn't have time to explain. Without thinking, he grabbed her by the arm and yanked her back, pulling her toward the counter just as she took a step toward the door. She stumbled, thrown off balance, but just as she did, a car screeched past the window, narrowly missing the spot where she would have been standing. Zane stood there, panting. His heart raced as the vibrations in his chest began to calm down, settling back into something more familiar. The future he had seen had been averted. The woman blinked at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with confusion. I don't understand," she said softly, clutching her latte in shaking hands. How did you know?" Zane looked at her, his mind still reeling from the strange clarity of the moment. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Instead, he just nodded. There was no explanation for what had happened. He didn't even know how to explain it himself. You saved me," she said, her voice small now, quieter than before. Zane said nothing. The tremors in his chest had faded, but the unsettling feeling that something else was out there lingered. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't know what it all meant. Zane stood there, feeling the odd weight of the woman's gratitude settle heavily in the air between them. She took a shaky breath, looking him over as if trying to understand what had just happened. But there was no way for her to know, no easy explanation for the strange moment that had passed between them. I don't know what you did, but thank you," she said, her voice still trembling. Zane nodded, though he didn't have any real answer to give. His mind was still spinning, his body still buzzing with the aftershock of what had just happened. He wanted to say something, explain it to her, make it seem normal, but there were no words. Not yet. The woman left soon after, still clutching her latte like a lifeline, stepping out of the shop and disappearing into the crowd outside. Zane watched her go through the window, feeling the usual hum of the city around him, but it was muted now, distant, as if the world had just shifted in a way he couldn't quite place. His heart was still beating faster than it should have been, and his hands were shaking slightly. He needed to calm down, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. Something bigger. It had happened before, the moments when the vibrations were so intense, so demanding, that Zane could barely handle them. At first, he had thought they were just coincidences. Little ripples in time that he could sense but never fully understand. But lately, the vibrations had become more frequent, more insistent. They were no longer just flashes of future possibilities, they were becoming demands, urging him to act. He tried to get back to his routine, wiping down the counter and sorting through the usual orders. But every time he reached for a cup, every time his fingers brushed the smooth surface of the espresso machine, the vibrations pulsed through him again, sharper this time, almost like an echo of the woman's near-miss with the car. The rest of the day passed in a haze, the steady rhythm of the coffee shop becoming a background hum to his racing thoughts. Zane couldn't focus. He kept thinking about that moment. The woman. The future he had felt, so tangible, so real. What would have happened if he hadn't intervened? Would she have died? Or would the vibrations have shifted again, saving her by some twist of fate? He had seen the future before, but this was different. It wasn't just a momentary flash. It was a fragment of something larger. Something he couldn't quite control. By the time his shift ended, Zane was exhausted, his mind buzzing with too many unanswered questions. He made his way to the exit, his fingers brushing the doorframe as he pushed it open. The cool evening air hit him like a wave, but the moment he stepped outside, the vibrations hit him again, stronger now, more intense that he froze. In the distance, he felt it. A pulse, like a deep breath drawn by the city itself. He could almost hear it, this thrum beneath the normal noise of cars, pedestrians, and streetlights. And then, in the next breath, another pulse, closer this time. It was like the heartbeat of the city was shifting, changing, rearranging itself. Zane's chest tightened. This wasn't normal. The world wasn't supposed to feel like this. His instincts kicked in, and he turned toward the source of the vibrations, heading down the street, weaving through the evening crowd. The vibrations felt familiar, like the start of something he had felt before, the kind of moment when everything was about to change. He followed the pull, his feet moving quickly, almost without thought. He didn't know where he was going, but the vibrations led him forward, urging him on. There was a building just ahead, a half-dilapidated old structure that had been boarded up for years. It had been abandoned for as long as Zane could remember, the windows blacked out, the doors sealed shut. But tonight, the vibrations led him straight to it. As he stood in front of the building, the hum around him grew louder, sharper. He could feel the pulse reverberating through the pavement beneath his feet, as if the building itself was alive, pulsing with a strange energy. Zane reached out with his hands, pressing his fingers to the cool, crumbling stone of the wall. There it was again, a flash. This time, it was clearer than ever before. The door to the building slammed open, a man stumbling out into the street, clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. Zane could see the entire sequence unfold in his mind. The man would collapse, gasping for air, and before help could reach him, it would be too late. Zane could feel the timeline stretching in front of him, each moment unfolding with a terrible inevitability. He knew he couldn't let it happen. With a sense of urgency, Zane moved toward the door. His fingers brushed the cold handle, and with a deep breath, he pushed it open. The hinges creaked loudly, but the sound was drowned out by the roaring in his ears. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, abandoned papers fluttered in the breeze, and in the center of the room, a lone figure stood barely visible in the gloom, but the vibrations radiating from him were unmistakable. The man's breathing was ragged, each inhalation sounding like a struggle. His eyes flickered toward Zane, his face twisted in confusion. "You're too late," the man rasped. "You can't stop it. It's already done." Zane felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He wasn't sure how, but the man's words felt true. The future, the one he had seen, was already in motion, but there was still time. Zane moved quickly, rushing forward and grabbing the man's arm before he could collapse. The vibrations surged in his chest, the urgency overwhelming him. He could feel the moment when it would happen. The man would fall, would die if Zane didn't act. He gritted his teeth and yanked the man toward him, pulling him out of the building and into the open air. The man struggled weakly, but Zane didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop, and just as the man's knees buckled, Zane managed to steady him, holding him up as he gasped for breath. It wasn't over yet. Zane wasn't sure if it would be enough, but he couldn't stop now. The air around them shimmered with the weight of the moment, the vibrations settling like a storm passing over them. Zane watched as the man's breath slowed, his chest rising and falling in shallow motions. The sense of impending doom started to fade, replaced by a strange calm. The man looked at him, eyes wide with disbelief. How did you know?" Zane didn't answer. He couldn't answer. The future, the vibrations, it was all too much to explain, and even if he could, he wasn't sure the man would believe him. The man's breathing steadied, and Zane finally let go, stepping back. He couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play here. This wasn't just about saving one life. There were larger forces at work, shifting beneath the surface of his actions, and the more he interfered with the timeline, the more he felt the weight of the consequences pressing in on him. Zane turned and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate. The vibrations still hummed in his chest, but they were quieter now, like the calm after a storm. He didn't know what was coming next, but he could feel it. The city's pulse was changing again, and soon, the balance would tip. The future wasn't something that could be fixed, not by him, not by anyone. But there was still time. There had to be. Zane walked into the night, feeling the vibrations beneath his feet, wondering what would happen if he stopped trying to change the future and let it unfold on its own. Zane walked through the quiet streets, the vibrations in his chest still pulsing, but softer now, more distant. The night had settled into an eerie stillness, the usual hum of the city stifled by the weight of the moment. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him. His hand still trembled slightly, the adrenaline of saving the man still pumping through his veins, but beneath it, there was something else, a gnawing sense of dread. Every time he changed something, every time he intervened, the vibration seemed to change, grow more complex, like a web of consequences he couldn't fully untangle. As Zane moved deeper into the night, his mind kept replaying the man's words, "You can't stop it. It's already done." There was a finality to that. A truth he couldn't ignore. The world felt like it was unraveling, but not in a way that he could control. The more he tried to push back against fate, the more things slipped through his fingers. He found his way to a park bench near a quiet intersection, a place he often visited to clear his mind. The cool breeze rustled the leaves in the trees above him, but the vibrations were still there, tugging at him, urging him forward. He sat, closing his eyes, trying to block out the world around him and focus. He needed to understand this. He needed to know what was happening. The vibrations had come to him as a gift. A curse. Maybe both. He'd once thought they were just random flashes, fleeting impressions of things to come, like scattered pieces of a puzzle he could never quite piece together. But now, it was more than that. The more he tried to change the future, the more he felt the consequences multiply. It was as if the universe had a way of resetting itself, a counterbalance that Zane couldn't hope to match. Every time he saved someone, something else went wrong. Every time he changed the course of a moment, the ripple effect expanded. He had to stop. But he couldn't. A sound broke his reverie, a soft, almost imperceptible rustle in the distance. He opened his eyes. The park was empty, save for the flickering streetlight casting a long shadow across the ground. But the vibrations, their hum had changed again. The energy was sharper now, not from the people around him, but from something else. Something that had been building. Zane stood up, his body tensing as the pull of the future became stronger, more focused. It wasn't just a faint disturbance anymore, it was a signal, loud and insistent. Without thinking, he started walking, his feet moving faster than his mind. He didn't know where he was going, but the pull was undeniable. It led him to a small alleyway between two buildings. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete, the kind of place people avoided, but Zane was drawn to it like a magnet. And then he saw her, the woman from the coffee shop. Zane stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding as his mind struggled to catch up with what was happening. She was standing there, her back turned to him, just standing in the middle of the alley, her hands clasped in front of her. She was as still as a statue, as if waiting for something. Or someone. Zane's mind raced. How could she be here? He'd saved her, pulled her back from the path of that car hours ago. She shouldn't have been anywhere near this alley. And yet, here she was. The same woman, still alive, but somehow different. There was something in the air, a tension, a wrongness. The vibrations were coming from her now, stronger than ever, and for the first time, Zane felt something like fear creep up his spine. The future had shifted again. She wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't the way it was supposed to happen. "Are you okay?" Zane called out cautiously, his voice breaking the stillness of the alley. The woman turned slowly, her face unreadable. When she spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "I don't know why I'm here," she said, her eyes flicking around as if confused by her surroundings. I feel like I'm supposed to be somewhere, but I don't know where." Zane took a step forward, his instinct screaming that something was wrong. "I saw you earlier." I know," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "I know you saved me. But I don't understand. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to die." Zane's heart skipped a beat. The vibrations in his chest were so loud now, almost deafening. He felt a sudden surge of panic. "No, this isn't right. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be alive." "Listen to me," Zane said, his voice steadying despite the storm in his chest. "You weren't supposed to die today. You were supposed to go on living. I don't know how it works, but I felt it. I felt the future change." The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide, and for the first time, Zane saw something in her expression that he hadn't noticed earlier: fear. True fear. The kind of fear that came from knowing that something was out of your control. "I was supposed to die," she whispered again. "I can feel it. The future. I can feel it, too. I'm not supposed to be here, Zane. Not anymore." Zane's heart stuttered at the mention of his name, but before he could say anything, the vibrations shifted once more, growing more intense, more violent. A sudden pulse rushed through him, and in that split second, he understood that it wasn't just her life that had been altered. It was everything. By saving her, by changing the course of that moment, he had disrupted something far more significant. The vibrations he had been feeling weren't just flashes of events anymore, they were warnings. Warnings that something was going to break. The woman's body shook violently, her eyes clouding over, and Zane reached out to grab her arm, steadying her as the tremors racked her form. "I don't understand," she gasped, her voice breaking. "What's happening? What did we do?" "I don't know," Zane said, his own breath coming in sharp gasps as the vibrations began to feel like they were about to tear him apart. The future was no longer something he could read. It was something he was trapped within, something that was unraveling all around him. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, as if the world itself was being pulled in different directions. The vibrations grew sharper, like a knife cutting through the air, and then, with a jolt, Zane saw it: flashes of future events, but not like before. This time, it wasn't just fragments. It was a cascade, a rapid succession of disasters, each one more catastrophic than the last. It was as if every change he'd made was compounding, building on itself in a way that he couldn't control. He was causing the very thing he had tried so hard to avoid. "No," he muttered, backing away. "This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just supposed to be a moment. Just one moment." The woman's gaze met his, her expression full of understanding, as if she had seen it, too, the same chain of events, the same awful collapse of reality. "We can't undo it," she whispered, her voice a mere echo against the rising storm of vibrations. Zane staggered back, his chest tightening as the vibrations increased in intensity. He felt as though the very fabric of time itself was buckling beneath him. The future, once so clear, was now slipping through his fingers like sand. There was no way to stop it. The woman reached out, her hand trembling as she touched Zane's arm. "You've seen it too, haven't you? The end of everything." Zane opened his mouth, but no words came. He could only nod, his mind racing as the vibrations reached a crescendo. It wasn't just her life that had been changed. It was everything, every moment, every tiny shift he had made. Like a stone dropped in a pond, the ripples had grown until they consumed everything in their path, and with that, Zane understood, there was no stopping it now. The future was broken, and the only thing left to do was watch it fall apart.